And so that got me thinking about what it is that is actually unique about civil disobedience, what it does that all other forms of activism don't do, and why it's been so important to so many social movements. And the key point that I started focusing on, that I've actually been focusing on for a while, is the vulnerability that is inherent in civil disobedience. And I think what was missing from the trial this week was an understanding that the intent of civil disobedience is not just to commit a crime. The intent is not just to get media attention. The intent is not to get word out about something. The intent of civil disobedience is to arouse the conscience of a community in order to build the kind of public pressure that is necessary to resist the corporate control of our government. And the tool through which civil disobedience works towards that intent of arousing conscience is the tool of vulnerability. Because civil disobedience is inherently breaking a crime or breaking a law and risks oneself before the power of the criminal justice system, and it often has an element of physical risk and physical vulnerability, like Abby being at the top of a tripod in front of a train, that vulnerability rattles people out of their everyday lives. It awakens people's conscience because I believe there's something fundamental about people, something fundamental about our human nature, in which when we see someone else in a vulnerable position, particularly someone who puts themselves in a vulnerable position, we can't completely look away. There's a part of ourselves that cannot look away from this person who is in trouble and needs help, that it is embedded into who we are as people, that we feel called to look deeply at these people who need our help. And it's that power of vulnerability that can break through the lethargic apathy that is rampant in our consumer society. It's what rattles people out of all their other concerns with their job and their bills and their TV shows that they like and everything else that sort of numbs people to the threats and all the information about those threats that we face. And as all of us who are activists know, it's hard to get through to a lot of folks. And we can give them lots of information. We can knock on their door and try to talk to them. We can call them up and all these things. And still we have such an apathetic, disengaged society that cares more about consumerism than protecting future generations. And it's vulnerability that uniquely can break through that and can arouse people's conscience, as we saw happened this week with those jurors. That it was only because they were sort of forced to look at what was happening in this case, and they were forced to look at the vulnerability of the activists that were in front of them, that they were rattled out of their everyday apathy, and now they're going to be at Abby's next lobby day. And so I think that shows that these working within the system kind of actions are not completely detached from the civil disobedience actions that are outside the law, that they're intertwined, that they work together, that the civil disobedience arouses a conscience so that people can be more engaged in those democratic processes. So it actually does something entirely unique. And I think that speaks to that point of no reasonable legal alternatives. There are plenty of legal reasonable alternatives that can raise a little bit of awareness, that can educate some folks. There are no legal alternatives that do that work of arousing conscience, because civil disobedience is more than just an intellectual kind of activism. It's a spiritual kind of activism. in which through our vulnerability, we open up the most vulnerable parts of ourselves, which invites out that vulnerable part of others. And so what I learned this week is that even as we go through these court cases and we have to fight against all these legal technicalities, that we have to engage in that as a spiritual struggle. We have to engage in that, making this spiritual argument about what it is fundamentally about people that can be awakened, and I think that's been kind of reinforcing for me, because a big part of the reason that I chose to go to divinity school a few years ago was I realized that we have reached the limit of what we can do as a movement without soul. That in order to move forward and make progress, that we need to be a movement that is grounded in our fundamental spirituality. We need to be a movement with spirit and be willing to wade into that territory of not just the scientific facts of what we face with climate change, but the spiritual context of who we think we are as people and who we think we are as a society. And I think we got a lot closer to that this week. We got a lot of resources to be able to do that better in the future. And most of all, I think we got that demand from this week. The demand from this week, I feel like, is that in order to move forward and in order to realize our full power in this movement, we have to come into it as full people, with our full selves, including our spiritual selves. And so with that, I'll wrap it up, and I think we'll be able to have lots of time for question and answer. And I thank you all for being here.